The hallway outside the Jefferson Parish Courthouse smelled like floor wax and cold coffee, and Renee's voice carried over both. She wasn't quiet about it. She never had been. And she wanted the room to hear when she said that swamp girls always find a way to embarrass a good family. A woman near the vending machine looked up from her phone. Grant laughed. Low and easy. The kind of laugh that told me he'd heard this joke 100 times before and never once thought to end it. I sat with my folder in my lap and said nothing, because 11 years of sirens and evacuation calls had taught me that silence costs less than a reaction people are hunting for. The bailiff opened the doors and called the docket number, and everyone stood. That was when Judge Patrice Doucet walked in carrying her files against her chest, and she stopped mid-step. She looked across the room and found me the way you find someone you've stood next to during a crisis. And for a second, the whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath with her. She said it plainly. No ceremony. Just recognition. Director Reyes. It's been a while since the state hearing. I told her it had, and that I was glad to see her again. Grant's smile folded in on itself, and Renee's mouth opened with nothing behind it. Behind me, someone whispered director of what, and I didn't turn around. Because I already knew that whatever they thought they understood about my life for the last 10 years was about to come apart in front of everyone who'd ever laughed along with them. I grew up in the marshes south of Homa, in a house my father built with his own hands, where the tide told you more about the day than any clock on the wall. My people worked shrimp boats for 3 generations, and nobody in that house ever apologized for the smell of diesel or the mud on their boots. My mother used to say that the water didn't care where you came from, only whether you respected it. And that lesson followed me into every job I ever took. I left the marsh at 19 for a state training program in emergency response, and by 28 I was running evacuation logistics for an entire parish during hurricane season. Nobody in Grant's family ever asked what that actually meant. To them, I was just gone half the summer. Unreachable during storms. Missing dinners while entire neighborhoods waited on my calls to know whether to leave their homes. Grant called it my parish job in front of his coworkers, said it like it was something you did between real careers, and I let it sit there because correcting him in front of a room never once won me anything. Renee never asked either. She'd ask about my garden instead, or whether I'd finally learned to cook a proper roux, as if that was the ceiling of what a woman like me could offer a family like hers. For 10 years, I told myself the silence was patience. Something steady I was choosing, rather than something being taken from me. I kept every one of those years the same way I kept a storm log. Quietly, without complaint. Certain that the record would matter eventually, even if no one asked to see it. It wasn't until I sat in that hallway listening to Renee laugh at my own front door that I understood patience and permission had never been the same thing. I had spent a decade being patient with people who had simply never planned on asking me anything at all. The parish gave me a commendation the spring. I coordinated evacuation for 11,000 people ahead of a Category 3. And Grant didn't come to the ceremony because a client dinner ran long. When I got home that night, still in my field jacket, he was already asleep. And the only sign he'd thought about my day at all was a text sent hours earlier that said, "Hope it went fine." I stood in the kitchen a long time before I went to bed, telling myself a man tired from his own work simply forgets sometimes. The way you tell yourself a lot of things when you're not ready to hear what they actually mean. 2 weeks later, he introduced me to a new client at a dinner as the one who does parish paperwork during storms. And I watched the client nod politely and move on to someone more interesting. Renee had her own version of the same dismissal. Softer. Dressed up as concern. She'd call on a Sunday and ask if I'd had time to finish canning the tomatoes. And when I mentioned I'd spent the week managing shelter logistics for 300 families, she'd say, "That's nice, dear," and pivot straight to whether I'd thought about joining her garden club. Like real accomplishment only counted if it came with a trowel in your hand. I started noticing the pattern the way I noticed weather fronts. Small shifts that meant nothing alone but everything stacked together. And I began keeping records without fully admitting to myself why. I kept every pay stub, every reimbursement form, Every mortgage statement in a fireproof box in the hall closet. The same instinct that made me log wind speeds and evacuation times without being asked. It wasn't suspicion yet. Not exactly. It was just the habit of a woman who had learned that things left unrecorded had a way of disappearing when it was convenient for someone else. Grant noticed the box once and asked why I bothered. And I told him some people keep photo albums. I keep proof. And he laughed like I'd made a joke. I hadn't been joking. And some part of me already knew that eventually somebody in that house was going to need me to have kept it. I came home 2 days early from a storm deployment on the Texas border, still smelling like diesel and standing water, rolling my duffel bag across the driveway before Grant even knew I was back in the state. The house was quiet in a way that felt wrong, the kind of quiet you learn to read after enough years walking into rooms that aren't supposed to be empty. I found his laptop open on the kitchen counter, still logged into his email, a message thread with Bryn Castile sitting right there on the screen without a single password between me and it. I didn't go looking for it. I want to be clear about that. It was simply sitting open the way. The truth sometimes is when nobody expects you home this soon. I read enough to understand. Then I closed the laptop and sat down at the same table where I used to spread out storm maps at 2 a.m. Grant came in an hour later and stopped in the doorway when he saw my face. And there wasn't any script for what came next because I didn't raise my voice and I didn't throw anything. I just asked him how long. He said 7 months. Quiet. Like the number itself was the confession, and everything else was just detail. 7 months of dinners I'd missed for good reason, while he'd been missing them for a different one entirely. I asked if it was still going on, and he said yes. Present tense. No hesitation. Which told me more than the 7 months had. I didn't cry in front of him. I saved that for later. Alone. In a truck parked outside a gas station 40 minutes from a house I wasn't ready to walk back into yet. What I felt sitting at that table wasn't rage. It was recognition. The same flat clarity I got standing in a shelter after a storm, surveying what was left and what wasn't. I already knew. Sitting there. That I was going to need every pay stub and every mortgage statement in that fireproof box a lot sooner than I'd planned. Preston Ardoin stood first, buttoning his jacket the way lawyers do when they think the morning is going their way, and told Judge Doucet that Grant had been the primary financial provider throughout the marriage and that an even split of the estate was the only fair outcome. Grant nodded along like a man watching his own argument being made better than he could have made it himself. Judge Doucet asked if Mrs. Reyes disputed that characterization, and I stood and said I did, and that I had documentation. And I watched Ardoin's confidence flicker for just a second before he covered it with a small, confident smile. I handed the bailiff my exhibit. Copies going to both tables. And Judge Doucet started reading before anyone else did. It was 11 years of pay records from the parish, deployment stipends from state mutual aid activations, and mortgage statements showing exactly who had paid what and when. All of it lined up month by month without a gap in it. Ardoin flipped through 3 pages and stopped, his eyebrows lifting the way a man's do when the ground under his argument quietly disappears. He looked at Grant and asked, low enough that he probably thought I couldn't hear it, "Did you know about this?" And Grant didn't answer him right away. Judge Doucet looked over her glasses and asked Grant directly whether he had ever reviewed his wife's income during the marriage. And he said he'd known I worked for the parish, which wasn't really an answer to the question she'd asked. She asked again, more precisely, whether he knew the actual figures, and he admitted he didn't, that he'd never really asked. Ardoin set the pages down slowly and asked Grant, in front of the whole courtroom, how he could claim primary provider status for a marriage where he couldn't name what his wife earned in a single year of it. Grant had no answer for that either, and the silence he left in its place said more than anything he could have come up with. I sat back down while Judge Doucet made a note. Unhurried, the same way she probably wrote up storm declarations. Methodical and without any interest in theater. Ardoin asked for a short recess to confer with his client, and Judge Doucet granted it. and as the room shifted and murmured around me, I understood that the mortgage numbers were only the opening exhibit. There was still the fireproof box waiting in the truck outside, and everything in it that Renee didn't yet know I had. When the recess ended, I opened the fireproof box for the second exhibit, and Ardoin's face told me he understood this wasn't going to be about mortgage payments anymore. I handed the bailiff a second folder, copies for both tables, and Judge Doucet started reading with the same unhurried focus she'd given the first one. This exhibit showed a pattern of charges on the joint account over the 7 months I now had a name and timeline for: hotel stays, dinners, a jewelry purchase. All of it paid from money that was supposed to belong to both of us. Ardoin looked at Grant and asked if he had any explanation for the charges. And Grant said nothing. I just stared at the table like the wood grain might offer him something to say. Then came the transfer records. And this was the part even I had needed a minute alone with before I could bring it into a courtroom. 3 weeks before the financial disclosure deadline, $42,000 had moved out of our joint brokerage account into one held solely in Renee's name. And the wire authorization had Grant's signature on it. I handed over the printed messages that went with it, texts between Grant and his mother, and Judge Doucet read them slowly enough that I watched Renee's hands start to shake in her seat. One message from Renee read, "Move it, before she notices. It's safer with me for now," and another one said she'll never think to check. She's always gone with the storms. Judge Doucet looked up from the page and asked Renee directly whether she had encouraged her son to move marital funds into her personal account before disclosure. Renee opened her mouth and closed it once before she finally said she was only trying to protect the family. And Judge Doucet asked, "Protect it from what?" "Exactly." And Renee didn't have an answer that didn't sound like exactly what it was. Ardoin turned to Grant and asked when he had planned on telling anyone about this. His own attorney. And Grant said he hadn't. That his mother told him it would be handled quietly. Judge Doucet set the pages down and said, without raising her voice at all, that Louisiana law had a name for this: dissipation of community assets, and that the court would be crediting the full amount back to the marital estate before any division took place. Renee started to say something else and then stopped herself. And for the first time since I'd known her, she looked smaller than the room around her. Grant turned his head slowly and looked at his mother, the way you look at someone you're seeing clearly for the first time. Not with anger yet. Just recognition landing late. I sat with my hands folded in my lap. Not triumphant. Just steady. Because I had spent 11 years learning that the worst damage rarely announces itself. It just waits quietly until someone finally opens the right folder. Judge Doucet called for a short recess before closing arguments. And when we filed back into the hallway, I noticed the seat beside Grant was empty. Bryn had been sitting there all morning, quiet, taking in exhibits she clearly hadn't known existed until they were read aloud. By the time court reconvened, she was gone. No note. No goodbye to Grant. Just her purse missing from where it had been hanging on the chair. I understood it without needing anyone to explain it to me. She had heard the words dissipation of community assets and realized she didn't want her name anywhere near what came next. Back inside, Judge Doucet asked Grant one final time whether he disputed any of the financial evidence presented. And he said no. Quiet. Final. The fight gone out of his voice completely. She asked if he had anything further to add before ruling. And he said only that he wished he'd asked me more questions over the years, which was as close to honesty as I'd heard from him in longer than I could remember. Ardoin didn't argue the point. He simply nodded and let the silence stand. Because there was nothing left in his folder that could undo what mine had already shown. Judge Doucet delivered the ruling plainly. The $42,000 restored to the marital estate before division. The house to be sold. My contributions to the mortgage and Grant's education fully credited in the final accounting. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Renee caught up to me before I reached my truck. Her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. And she said she was sorry. that she'd spent years assuming a woman who worked with her hands couldn't possibly understand what her family had built. I told her I understood exactly what her family had built, better than anyone in it, since I was the one who'd been keeping the books. By that evening, a coworker of Grant's had already called to ask if the rumors were true, and by the end of the week, 2 of the vendors his company worked with had quietly moved their contracts elsewhere. I didn't chase any of it. I didn't need to, because in a parish where everyone eventually hears about everyone else's storm, some stories simply outrun the people who caused them. 6 months later, I was back at the parish office before dawn, running storm season drills the same way I had for 11 years. Only now, nobody in that building needed to hear a judge say my title out loud for it to mean something. The house sold that spring, and I used part of my share to fix the roof on my parents' place down in the marsh. The same roof my father had put up himself 30 years earlier. I still keep a fireproof box in my hall closet. Old habit. Though these days it holds nothing more dramatic than tax returns and my truck title. Last month, a new recruit named Dana joined our evacuation training program. 19 years old. Straight off a shrimp boat. Apologizing for her accent before she'd even finished introducing herself. I told her the water doesn't care what your voice sounds like, only whether you show up when it rises. And she looked at me like nobody had ever put it to her that plainly before. Watching her take notes that morning, steady hands, sharp eyes, I recognized someone who was going to spend a few years being underestimated before the world finally caught up to her. Some evenings now, I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and listen to the marsh settle into dark. And there's a kind of quiet out there that doesn't feel like waiting for anything anymore. I'm seeing someone new these days. A man who asks me actual questions about my work and remembers the answers, which turns out to matter more than I ever let myself admit. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry out of this with you, it's that the people who dismiss your work rarely deserve the silence you give them in return. Keep your own records. Ask for what you're owed. And never let anyone convince you that quiet work is small work,